So, good afternoon to all of you. Vienna Humanities Festival, the second day. Welcome to this and welcome to this session on the power of the powerless. The title of the whole festival is Macht und Ohnmacht, Power and Powerlessness. The piece that we are going to discuss today has both of these in the title, the power of the powerless. It has Macht and Ohnmacht, power and powerlessness already in the title. And we are going to discuss this piece by Václav Havel. And if you read the program that was coming out for the Vienna Humanities Festival, you will find this one big sentence in the program about this event this afternoon, saying it was probably the greatest text ever written, depicting the nature and the fragility of late communist power. Quote from our program. This is quite an announcement on the one hand, quite a big sentence, and on the other hand also it can be understood as a signal, okay, this is late communist power, why should we really care any longer today? But before this thought really takes place in our minds, I would like to link it back to the lecture that was opening the Vienna Humanities Festival on Thursday, the lecture by Tim Snyder. I guess some of you or many of you might have been for that talk. And as it turns out, Tim Snyder not only has published a new book, The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, America. That was the book that he was presenting on Thursday. But he has also written a new foreword, a new introduction to a new edition of Václav Havel's Power of the Powerless in English. And when I quoted this one sentence saying, this is the greatest text ever written depicting the nature and fragility of late communist power, Tim Snyder tells us, in fact, this is not only depicting the nature and fragility of late communist power, it is precisely depicting modern unfreedom, it is precisely depicting our contemporary Western societies. This is his statement in his introduction to the new English edition of this book. So I think both of these statements open up a space that will be the ground that we relate to in our discussion today, namely both aspects. On the one hand, the historical meaning that this text has and had, the historical circumstances of its being written, and the immediate impacts and effects that it had on the later development, maybe leading up to the Velvet Revolution of 1989, and also on its contemporary meaning. And luckily, I'm not the only one to share this with you this afternoon. Sorry, it's not yet night. But with me, I have Milan Hanyš. I'm very happy to have him here on the stage. Milan Hanyš is a colleague from Prague, assistant professor at the Faculty of Humanities at Charles University, Prague. He holds a MA in philosophical and social anthropology from Charles University, as well as a PhD from the same university in philosophical anthropology. The topic of his dissertation, his thesis, was dedicated to, as he calls it, the apostle of the philosophers, St. Paul, so a philosophical reading of St. Paul, I guess. But very much of his recent work has also been dedicated to topics that are much closer to what we are doing today. Hannah Arendt was a name that was very important for his research. He has worked and written a lot on Hannah Arendt's concepts of republicanism and also especially on the concept of civil disobedience in Hannah Arendt, which also brings us closer to today's talk. And obviously Václav Havel as well, and this is what we're going to discuss with you now. And I'd like to say as a statement of welcome to Milan, I'm very happy that you are joining us on this, and also I take it as a good indicator for the relevance of Havel's text that you, as a relatively young scholar, dedicate your work to this. You were not even born when the text on the power of the powerless was written. And at a time when Havel himself is almost a persona non grata on the Czech political scene, when very few people still discuss his concept and maybe do not even take him serious as a politician any longer, I think take it as a very good indicator that you dedicate your work to him and his work. And dedicating does not mean that you're uncritical, The real evil is ignorance, I think, and we can still be critical, but you are working on this, and I take this as a good indicator. So, to start, just for the setup of this talk this afternoon, I promise to you that we will leave time towards the end. Sometimes this is a problem when the stage gets off and the people just talk among themselves. This will not be the case. I promise to you I will leave at least the last 20 minutes for the discussion with all of you. I cannot promise that all of you will have the saying that he or she wants to have, but I will promise that we leave the time for this. So to start, Milan, the title of the Vienna Humanities Festival is Power and Powerlessness. If you go to the talks, I would just say I would hold the bet that very many or all of them will speak about power. But will there be talks that do also speak about powerlessness? I'm not really sure. If you have the title Macht und Ohnmacht, this is like power and something, but the something is not really interesting. It's just the little antagonism at the end, Macht und Ohnmacht. In fact, I would say that maybe this neglected Ohnmacht, this neglected powerlessness, the second element of the title, is maybe something that is extremely relevant for discussions of today. And if you, and that is my impression, if you look at the political setup of today, I think very much of what we are discussing is actually emotions or feeling of powerlessness. And if you relate this to the populist movement that we are speaking about everywhere in Europe and in the world, this is an emotion of powerlessness, right? I mean, we are not listened to. Nobody understands what we want to say. Nobody listens to us. The elites, they do their own stuff. They don't listen to us. But funnily, also those who are spoken about, the elites, they say the very same thing. Well, this is not in our influence. This is not us. And even the politicians tell us, well, there was no alternative. I had to do this. We are totally powerless. So this discussion on powerlessness seems to be something that is highly relevant for our time. And I think it is a good opportunity to discuss this going back to this one iconic, crucial text written by Václav Havel in 1978 on the power of the powerless. And maybe, Milan, this is a starting point for you where you can have like a first reflection on the meaning of power and powerlessness in Havel. And then I say in a second approach, we will also try to speak more about the historical meaning and the historical impacts that it had. Please, Milan.
Okay, thank you, Ludger, for a nice introduction, and thank you for coming and having me. Firstly, let's draw a picture. Imagine yourself being in a heavily controlled authoritarian society led by a party which is backed by the mighty empire. You can add to the picture that the empire sent hundreds of thousands of troops and tanks into the country just a few years ago. And a vast part of them still remained to maintain the political stability. Additionally, all of those who in the years before the invasion of the occupiers tried to achieve a certain amount of freedom and proposed some reforms were fired from their jobs after the occupiers consolidated their power. So how would you feel? Where would be the hope? And would you feel powerful or powerless? Well, you could have easily noticed that I have in mind a particular example of Czechoslovakia after the Prague Spring and the Soviet invasion. But I have a reason why I put it in a more general way, since, similarly to Ludger, I want to point to a universal problem of power and powerlessness. The 70s in the Czechoslovakia were, as it were, an era of hopelessness or the age of a death-like motionlessness. Many of the previously active people felt desperate with no sense of power to change the current social or political affairs. But luckily not everyone felt into despair, and there were dissenters, among them, of course, Václav Havel, one of the most famous one, and their stance was different. Havel still tried to act freely, even in an authoritarian society, and it happened to be at least partially possible. In 1975, he wrote a public letter to Gustav Husák, the president of Czechoslovakia and the general secretary of the Communist Party. In the letter, he harshly pointed to the lies, to the cultural, moral, and political decay. The question why he did it. Did he really think that Gustav Husák would read the letter and that he would take the analysis seriously and his advices? Probably not. His aim was not to cause a sudden political change. The real aim was to do something freely, independently, and, as it were, throw those who were in power into the situation in which they will have to react. Thus it was an act of rebellion, since an individual was required to adjust to the requirements, expectations of those who hold power. Now it was Havel who did something unexpected and created a situation in which the holders of power felt uncomfortable. A few years later, Havel published this wonderful essay, The Power of the Powerless, which is probably the most influential and most famous text written in Czech. So who is powerless? According to Havel, what he wrote in the essay, almost nobody is powerless, even in a regime backed by the seemingly almighty empire. There are still some potentialities left even among the seemingly powerless people. And to understand the possibilities, one has to understand the nature of power. So power, according to Havel, is not a possession of the ruling party, nor it is located on the very top of society by the hands of the few. Instead, power permeates every individual and each social interaction. So power is not top-down relation or possession of the few. That would not mean that the Communist Party would have no power at all. It still had the army, intelligence agencies, police who can bully everyone. But it does not mean much without unquestioned obedience and performance of political rituals by the ordinary people. So I would say, firstly, power is a performative. How the power works practically and how it permeates society. This Havel describes with the famous story of the greengrocer who put the Communist Party slogan into the window of the shop. Why he did it, asks Havel. Did he believe in the words which were on the slogan? You know that there was written, "Workers of the world unite," the last imperative of the Communist Manifesto. Well, probably not. He did not even notice what's written on the slogan. He put it into the window because it is expected, and everyone does in the same way. So why are people doing this? Why are they putting slogans in their windows, the meaning of which is unimportant to them? Well, our greengrocer did it because the thing must be done to maintain his standard of living and his job. Basically, according to Havel, this means that he has fear. He is afraid of losing his job and potential consequences. So it has a very clear meaning for him. It expresses his loyalty and provides him the expectation of an undisturbed life. He knows that until he is doing what he is expected to do, he would maintain the job and he would not face any bad treatment. And so how he is related to the power? By acting according to the expectations, a greengrocer is not without his share in power, or to say it morally, without his guilt. By putting his slogan into the window, he reproduces the ideology, he reproduces the power, and even strengthens it. By doing this, he naturally produces pressure on other greengrocers and other people to do the same. He becomes, as it were, complicit in maintaining and enhancing the power of the regime. But Havel's goal is not to blame a greengrocer, but rather to show the potentiality in his situation. What if he did not put the slogan into his window? The others would then see that disobedience is possible, and maybe they might even join him. And even if he remains alone, the place of ideology is questioned. The almighty power of the regime is partially shaken. The potentiality of political change is then open, even if it is not yet fully used and realized. However, Havel is in the essay not so much concerned with the question of how to reform the regime, how to overthrow it, what kind of institutional changes should be done. He focuses instead more on a moral life of an individual. Life in a, he calls it, post-totalitarian society, enforce people to pretend that an official lie is truth. Enforce them to repeat those lies, share them, spread them. Speak them out in schools, in jobs, in offices. So an individual need not to accept all the lies and mystifications, as it were, internally into their minds, but they must behave as though they believe them. They have to pretend that they believe them. So this all-pervasive presence of lying and pretending, according to Havel, might profoundly damage humans' personality, dignity, and moral integrity. So what a greengrocer would gain when he refuses to put a meaningless slogan into the window of the shop? It is not primarily a hope for a near political change. What he will gain is more important and more profound. It is a moral recovery, according to Havel. An act of refusal or disobedience is an act of comeback of an alienated self, a comeback of human dignity. And that's particularly important for Havel, authenticity. He says basically this: it is not so much important to attempt for the change of the whole political system and present a whole vision or a new competing worldview, new ideology. What is more important is to live authentically, in accord with one's conscience and moral convictions. So, what kind of reward one gets for disobedience? What kind of satisfaction? For Havel, there is no direct positive reward from outside. Maybe even consequences might be harsh and unpleasant for him. Maybe he will not be promoted, his children will be punished by not being allowed to study. But the real satisfaction for a leap in authenticity and truth comes from inside. A person who refuses to live and lie regains one's lost dignity and freedom. And there is even something more still, a hope. Life in truth unveils the lies of the system and might inspire others to act similarly. Beneath the surface of the ideological facade dwells the so-called intentions of life. That is, authentic human wishes and life goals. These are very diverse and they do not fit usually into the ideology of the real socialism. The examples, like a wish to go to a rock concert or to read a forbidden book, to organize a meeting or party with friends, to care for the environment, or simply to work professionally in a thoroughly corrupted economical system. In a heavily controlled society, these are all potentially political acts, and sooner or later, the regime must burn out, since it provides not enough personal freedom for people to pursue their very diverse life goals. The argumentation of the essay was compelling and influential among the dissenters and oppositional circles in the societies of real socialism, and it remains its attractiveness till today among the people who are in opposition to authoritarian regimes. Even if there is no hope for a sudden political change, it has still a meaning to refuse to participate in the reproduction of the power relations. But you would not probably expect from me just a summary of Havel's argument, and I should also provide you, at least briefly, with my opinion. So here it is. I think one thing in this context particularly deserves our attention. Havel's analysis of the structure of power is excellent, and even the description of the possibilities of the individual are revealing. But what I personally miss in the text is a clear answer to one question, and it is following: how could you convince someone who does not care so much about moral issues and authenticity that it still makes sense to refuse obedience to the regime? You might say that there are things for which it is worse to suffer, which was a motto of Charter 77. But to accept this claim, one already has to have a serious concern about his or her moral integrity. And that's apparently not happening by everybody. The conscience and moral stances are very diverse. The conscience doesn't speak to the same voice to everybody. I mean, this question is not unimportant, since to really turn the seeming powerlessness into power, a dissenter needs to attract support from other citizens. And, I mean, not just a tiny group of Charter 77 signatories, but better a vast masses of people. Well, I don't want to blame dissenters for what they did or did not do in the difficult past. But I just want to teach myself a lesson, and I think here is a lesson. Moral arguments and moral concerns might be crucially important and decisive for some people, but might not be as essential and not so convincing for others. Well, we can express our grief for the fact. We can pity the people who do not care very much about the moral values we share, about authenticity, about conscience, but we have to count on it and do not presuppose that an existential revolution and moral reconstitution might happen on a broader scale. Maybe a more feasible way of opposition was made in Poland a few years later, where intellectuals joined workers and articulated common interests and opinions, and thus formed a very massive movement of solidarity, which the regime in Poland had to take very seriously. This did not happen in Czechoslovakia. And maybe one of the reasons for that was that Charter 77 did not speak out things which more people painfully felt as problems in their lives. The dissenters did not clearly speak out people's real problems, people's discontent with the regime and with their life in late socialism. And so finally, I want to make one conclusion related to the topic of power and powerlessness. Havel was right. Power is not a possession of the government or a ruling class. But I think one thing needs to be added. Power is not a possession of any individual, nor a party member, nor an oppressed citizen. Power appears only where more people join each other and share the same opinion or interest. Only when they join each other and act publicly, they might form a power group which can be seen and must be respected. If the opinion which they articulate is convincing enough for the many, they might be even powerful enough to expose a serious pressure on government. I think if one does not take into account this fact about power, one will remain as powerless as before. So that's basically my first introduction to the question of powerless, and I'm looking forward to your opinions, Ludger.
Yes, many things could be said. Obviously, you have really touched upon many things in your talk. I will reduce it to the two keywords that I announced in the very beginning: power and powerlessness. I will have two questions for you, Milan. Maybe you can try to address them shortly. And afterwards, I will, in a second step, I will also ask you about the historical importance of this text, because, as I said in the beginning, October 1978, in fact, it's exact 40 years. So I think, and this is a milestone somehow, and it deserves to be remembered as a historical milestone. So we will try to do that before we open up to all of you. So two short questions on what you just said on these two main key issues of power and powerlessness. Václav Havel's concept in Power of the Powerless is pathetic. I think this is not a daring thing to say. It's highly pathetic. The concept of power that he's relating to relies on just one single factor, and this one single factor is truth. Truth is the one that gives power to the powerless. Truth is the one that creates, generates power, brings about power. Highly pathetic, I said. I mean, if you have once read it, you will never forget. Václav Havel says, truth is a bacteriological weapon. It's infectious. Once you tell it to the people, they will give it on. This kind of power does not rely on an army of its own. It does not rely on a party of its own. The only thing that it relies on is the army of the enemy. And the truth that goes over to the army of the enemy and converts, so to speak, the whole army of the enemy for your point, because you have the quality of truth, or this is what is on your side. He calls it an existential revolution. He says any kind of revolution that just goes for systematic change, this is not what we intend. Not because we would be afraid of radical solutions. No, in fact, any revolution that just aims at systemic change is not radical enough for us. We want to be more radical. We want to have an existential revolution, which means, and this brings me back to what I said in the beginning, Tim Snyder in his lecture on Friday, this is exactly where he relates to Tim Snyder in his new foreword to Václav Havel's book says, Havel's diagnosis is a diagnosis of our contemporary, today's modern unfreedom, in which individuals enslave themselves because they do not ask themselves who they are and what they should be doing. Who are we? What should we be doing? These are the two essential questions. These are the two essential questions that Tim Snyder brings up. These are the two essential questions that Václav Havel brings up in his talk. It is exactly not to be ideological, but to be always critical about yourself, to always ask yourself. And this kind of truth, this kind of existential truth, allegedly, according to Václav Havel, is what brings about power. How do you react to this concept today? As I said, it's very easy to make fun of it. It's very easy to say, oh, this is so highly pathetic. But I just mentioned a highly influential author of our days, Tim Snyder, who gave this lecture in front of 1,000 people on Thursday, who relates exactly to the same issue, I'd say.
Okay, thanks for the question. Okay, I'm just thinking how to put it. Well, to me, this kind of reasoning is personally, persuasive. But I'm asking myself whether this kind of reasoning is persuasive enough also to my fellow citizens. And this is, I think, the question we should ask ourselves if we if we are unsatisfied with the political situation. Havel's essay and what Timothy Snyder said on Thursday, it is appealing to intellectuals. Havel's text gained much influence, but among intellectuals, among, as it were, intellectual elites. It's very easy when you take this argument seriously, when you try to push it in the public space, to fall into the danger that you are, as it were, posing yourself in a position where you preach and where you teach someone who is, uneducated. And I think that's a real danger. Intellectuals and politicians who real danger we need to avoid. And the threat is here, since this would bring kind of a cultural conflict into politics. And as intellectuals, we can never win this war, since the populists will be more successful in dividing people And so, what then is truth? Yeah, you know, to teaching people about facts, about truth is very difficult, and we've seen many countries in the world today that this type of approach and this type of moral arguments are not successful enough.
I mean, I'd just like to add on this, and then we can go over to the powerlessness. I'd just like to add on this. This is so interesting in Tim Snyder's reading of the book and in his foreword that he says, what seemed to be very odd to us some 10 or 15 years ago, he personally said it when I read it some 20 years ago, and Havel speaks about, all this technology, this Heideggerian approach, technology is so powerful that it overcomes us. We are not individuals ourselves any longer, but we are governed from somewhere else. To him, this always sounded very pathetic and out of time, but when you read it today, this is actually the moment when it starts speaking to it. It's all true today. It's all there, yeah? So all this analysis that seemed to be so outdated in Havel is actually the very current topic of today. Maybe we can go on with this in the discussion. I'll leave it as it is for the moment. One more question on powerlessness. Maybe also you can have a short reaction on that. As I said in the beginning, I think maybe to discuss powerlessness, Ohnmacht, is in some sense the more interesting issue than power. Everybody's speaking about power, but as I said, the debates of today are those of powerlessness and of people who feel powerless, who are powerless. One could say that, well, in some sense, people have more power than ever before. In a technological sense, we can do more. In an instrumental sense, we have more goods at our hands than ever before, but nevertheless people obviously seem powerless, and these are the debates of today. But I think also this is maybe also characteristic of today, that this kind of this argument of powerlessness can easily be misused and said, well, nobody ever takes us seriously, nobody is concerned about what we are doing, so we have to do something, we have to react on this finally, and the reaction then always becomes violent, becomes aggressive. It is a reaction of compensation. Since this is the state of affairs, nobody listens to us, it's overdone, we are waiting for a kind of salvation of a solution. Everybody understands what I'm alluding to. So it has this kind of danger, and I think also the argument of powerlessness has a capacity to blackmail. And this would be my question, and this already leads also over to the historical dimension of it. Did, according to your insight, wasn't it also the dissidents who somehow occupied this notion of powerlessness and said, well, this is us, we are the powerless, and we are thinking about new modes of finding power, getting power, doing something against this misuse of power on the other side? Because if you look at it, these circles of dissidents were very small, yeah. And they were maybe these circles of dissidents were as distant from the normal population, whatever that might be, than the government itself. So did they also somehow not take it over as an argument in their own favor and to some sense misused it? And does this maybe explain also why it never became a mass movement? It really remained a movement within very close circles, right?
Yeah, thanks. You're right. Yeah, the opposition movement, or Charter 77, remained it was a really tiny group of signatories, just 1,000 people, and it was very hard for them to spread their ideas, and the regime, which was really powerful enough to control the spread of information, flows of information, publications, organization, etc. So it was very hard to be politically active in this environment. So I really do not want to blame them that they weren't so much successful, since they had a very difficult situation. Havel was in a home arrest and under total control, and it was very hard even to push those essays out. So how it worked, the organization of Charter 77. There was not an efficient structure which could even the signatories in the charter, some of them were very, very discontent with what charter was doing and was not doing. So in this situation where you had many people with diverse opinions in the charter who even they had not a proper public space, as it were, and they were not able to communicate enough with each other, it was very difficult to gain a support from a wider public. But maybe it was, maybe also this was a result of this moral language and preoccupation of charter with moral issues. Since basically this kind of arguments were also blaming people. Havel tried not to do that explicitly, but it was very hard not to fall in this position that, okay, we are those who are brave enough to stay in a position and we can take consequences, but you're not. So, this kind of moral language, who is for something and who is not, it's, people don't like it to be blamed that we are those who are silently supporting the regime and therefore we are not living authentically. Yeah, that's not an idea you can go to people and tell them you haven't lived authentically. so this is, as I said in my previous talk, I think this is very persuasive for those who already share these ideas, who share this concern, like care for the soul or care for the legacy of Patočka. But outside of it, it's very difficult to gain support with such ideas. And Charter 77 in their documents, only a few of them were dedicated to a real social issues like economic reform, law reform, pollution of the environment, etc. I think only 7 or 8 of them, and there were hundreds of those documents. So they even didn't try very much to articulate the discontent of the people, and I think that's a lesson we can get from it. That to really compete with populist or with a mighty power, one has to ask people what's their discontent, what's paining, what they feel as painful in their lives. And that was probably not the question of moral integrity, I'm afraid.
Now I have a difficult task for you, Milan. I promise that we will leave enough time for the discussion. I will try to keep the promise. This is can we have 3 more minutes left? I will want to use these 3 minutes. This is why I said, and then immediately we'll go over. I promised that also, Milan, that we will have at least a short look at the historical significance of this text that is in some sense a milestone. It was written in close cooperation from the very beginning with Polish intellectuals, with Polish dissidents. It had a huge impact immediately internationally. I know it's an impossible task, but now I give you like 2 minutes to just tell us something about the historical significance. What did it mean for the development in Europe, in Eastern Europe especially? Just a short glimpse at that, and then we will open to all of you. So.
It was written in 1978, and Havel already was after his first arrest, which broke him. That was he was in a very difficult situation. He had previously no experience of being arrested, and so he abandoned the position of a spokesperson of Charter 77. And many of the signatories of Charter were very angry on him. Actually, this spread also some kind of a despair. Well, Patočka's death was not such a big issue immediately, but still then, after a few months, it was many of the previous elective people fell into despair. And so then the idea of a parallel polis connected with Václav Benda appeared, which proposed actually new program for how to live in a under late socialist regime. And it was basically this: let's create a parallel institutions. Let's create parallel educational institutions. Let's even try to create a parallel judiciary system. So it was very influential, Benda's essay. And after that came this famous, even more influential text of Havel, which as you said rightly, was very influential in Poland. And I think it would be very difficult to compare the situation of the Czech dissenters and Polish one, since also the state of economy was different and the role of the church in life. And so it's, as I said, it's very easy to blame dissenters in Czechoslovakia, what they did not do, but they had different circumstances, different conditions. Yeah, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. A philosopher, Gregor Flock, I would like to make a general point about the conception of power and powerlessness. I don't think it's very helpful to think of this as a bivalent spectrum. That's a term from logic. I mean, bivalence is basically the principle, scare quotes, that there are only two truth values, true and false, and I think that's a gross oversimplification. In the same sense, I think it would be a gross oversimplification to think of the power spectrum of there being consisting only of the two values of power and powerlessness. I think a more multivalent or gradualistic approach is called for here. Also, for the reason that if we only think in terms of power and powerlessness, we are disempowering ourselves by thinking, okay, they've got the power, we are the powerless, and we are kind of overlooking the fact that we actually do have power, just less. So that's also one of the reasons for why a multivalent approach to modeling the power spectrum is more helpful, in my opinion. So, any comments?
Yeah, I think you're right, and Havel would probably agree. Yeah, the situation you can frame it as there are people who have power who are almighty and those powerless, and we can deconstruct this. So yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right.
Well, I would like to ask you and add some comments, a little bit looking back in the context of the historical situation of the Czechoslovakia. Because in my mind, Czechoslovakia had a very experienced democratic history, you know. So people in Czech Republic haven't been out of practices of how to act and how to gain power. I think I would add that also this term of freedom is a very important aspect in Havel's and in the whole situations period context. And if I look back to what happened at the funeral of Jan Palach, I'm screaming nowadays about it. And some of the good sayings of the people at this time, from the Czech people, they absolutely knew that they are not powerless, and that Jan Palach, for example, he took power and he showed how to react. And I think this fundamental thing to be active as an individual, and not also what in this concept of Václav Havel is so important, not to suppress, but to become conscious of being a free person, what I am, what I should do. This is important to make politics. And I think he had also the long run or the long waiting to become active in a moment when the historical situation made it more easier. But I think that the people and the population in the Czech Republic was was able and was not powerless. It was just a different situation and many problems which came upon them, and in the historic moment when it's ready, they became active, and I think congratulations again. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the comment. I'm not a historian, I can't make any objections to what you said, and so if you don't mind, we can forward to another remarks and questions.
Thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you had an explanation for the change of Havel's discourse after 1989, because as I suppose any Western intellectual who read Power of the Powerless and Living in Truth and all the other political essays that he wrote, I was stricken by the fact it's the best analysis of communism, of the communist dictatorship in its everyday working that you can have. I mean, I thought it was brilliant, and I still think until today it is brilliant. But when Havel became president, the proposal of Power of the Powerless, which is not to blame people, but to tell them that they have the responsibility and the power to turn around this relationship with the communist regime, that they can change things if they want to at the individual level. This discourse changed completely with the Czech state's new politics of basically not saying that everybody was responsible, as Havel said, but on the contrary, that nobody was responsible, that the whole population was a victim of the regime, and only the Communist Party members and only the secret police collaborators were guilty, whereas the rest of the people were innocent. Yeah, which is pretty much exactly the opposite of what Havel was saying before. And yet he was the head of state and he endorsed this new politics, so at least he didn't say anything, and he was still president. So why? How is it possible?
Well, thank you for the nice question. Unfortunately, I have no clear answer to that. I'm not so experienced in studying Havel's life and intellectual development to somehow find an explanation. But yeah, the position changed dramatically. You're absolutely right in that. Maybe there's something to do with this responsibility, or feel some responsibility for the new state, and yeah, definitely. But okay, once you get into power, you are probably not anymore a free intellectual who can question every idea.
Hi, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about Havel's ideal political regime, let's say, even though the reality was different later after the communism ended, but still, what was his philosophical ideal political regime that he was creating in his mind? Because I think he was also critical about democracy, right?
Yeah, you're right, and it's somehow related to the previous question. And there are a few shifts in Havel's intellectual development. One is, if you take his discussion with Milan Kundera after the Soviet invasion, there Havel simply thinks that what is to be done is to accept the Western model of parliamentary democracy. Something different he says in The Power of the Powerless, where he is very critical towards Western democracy, towards parliamentary democracy, and proposes some kind of an informal structure, informal relations, which should be the more important and decisive in a better society, as it were. And another shift then happened by the end of the 80s, when he accepted simply that the acceptance of a Western model of liberal democracy. There are different questions, or at least these three possible questions possible answers to your question: what was Havel's idea of a so-called ideal society?
So we have to share the mic now. Sorry, just maybe as my answer to several of the questions before. I think once again, I just had, mentioned the foreword of Tim Snyder to this new English edition. I think this is also what he stresses in his foreword, that actually the notion of Havel, this relates to your question and the question before, is actually something that he calls pre-political. So Havel is always very helpful, Havel and many others, very helpful with his existential approach to fight off ideology. Tim Snyder says to come out under ideology, so to escape ideology, all ideological approaches. But this is what we very clearly see, and I think this was also Muriel's question and others, the very moment that this has had to be practiced as a parliamentary system, when social questions, economic questions come into play, I think it was all very, very quickly over. And there I think you see the clear limitations of the political concepts that you have in Havel and all the dissidents. But it is a very, very helpful tool, I would say, in a situation of a confrontation with ideologies, totalitarian ideologies, and how to get rid of those and how to escape these ideologies. Maybe this is an answer that somehow replies to many of the questions before. I think we had one more. The lady, you, okay. Sorry. Oh, you have one more. I didn't know.
That's very kind. Thank you very much. I have a slightly different question, actually. How much do you think the Catholic faith and the Catholic perception of the world is behind Havel's paradigm of individual resistance and integrity?
Okay, thanks. I don't think it is possible to put Havel into some traditional label like Catholic, Protestant, or pagan. No, I don't think it's adequate to his stance. He was definitely not a Catholic. Well, you can find many of the religious expression in his writings, particularly in letters from prison. But I wouldn't do this.
Aditya, you have an urgent question? The very last one, okay?
Thank you. So, Milan, if I may ask, request your mediation for somebody who is not familiar with the text. Because we all talked about a lot of the things that he talks about in this text: affect, performance, to act, not to act, moral, truth, consciousness, and then the fact that there was some contradiction in his own political life. Would you think that actually the point of such a text then is not really to actually embrace all of these and the different facets, but what does he say then about recognition? Because to me, from this whole discussion, it seems that the whole point of what he's saying and what Snyder was saying also is that actually how do we give people or ourselves the tools to recognize at any historical moment what the problems really are, and then we have the choice to act or react. What do you find? What do you think about the aspect of recognition in this?
Well, I'm afraid I didn't understand the question properly. So maybe would you be able to put it in one or two sentences briefly?
So you need again.
So to put it brief, to summarize it, the essential point of a philosophical, let's say, message of a text like this is not so much in preaching what we should do. Rather, it's saying that can you use this to think about whatever situation we are in and use that as a tool to recognize what the problem really is, and then you can decide what to do. Would that be a fair summary?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you grasp it perfectly. So I have not much to add. The very analysis of power is very interesting, revealing. We can find similar stances or expressions in some of other books, like a very early text of Etienne de la Boétie, It's called Discourse on the Voluntary Servitude. We didn't know much about Dylan de Boitier, just that he allegedly was a friend of Michel de Montesquieu. But in the text, he makes wonderful description of how power works, that actually it is not that they are succumbing to tyranny. They are willingly doing this. They are doing this from just because they are used to. And so they have power. And so Havel, I wouldn't say he read Etienne de Boitier, but he shared these ideas. And yeah, I mean, the analysis of power is very, very revealing and insightful. In this question, I would be more closer to Arendt, where Arendt doesn't think that the power is a relation of anybody, even those who are oppressed. But this is it's not a possession of anybody, even those who are oppressed, but it's always a relation. And so it's not enough to think about power and powerlessness in the terms of a possession of an individual, although it empowered, it strengthened those who were seemingly oppressed or who were seemingly powerless. Good.
So may I? We have 5 more minutes. I use this opportunity to tell you a little story that you can take home, and then I will put it into a final question to Milan, and then this session, unfortunately, is already over. So here's the little story, the little historical reference that I want to give you. Next to Václav Havel, maybe Milan Kundera is one of the best-known Czech intellectuals, writers of the very same epoch. The two of them, Havel and Kundera, for a very long time, already starting in 1968, had a long quarrel about what it means to be a dissident and how, in some sense, how useful, how senseful, how intelligible it is to be a dissident. And Kundera, from the very beginning, was attacking the dissidents, and Havel in person. It was also a personal fight. Well, that's a side story. It was very much of a personal fight. Kundera attacked Havel from the very beginning by saying that you dissidents, for you it's not a wise decision. It's totally unwise. Why do you go against a totalitarian regime, risking your own life, risking the life of your family, without having ever any hope for real change? It's just a stupid thing. And the only thing that I, Milan Kundera, can see that is sensible in this and that makes sense is that you want to be prominent and that you want to become a hero. This is the only thing that really matters. There was a long debate. Havel responded to it. Kundera responded back. And now this is the little story, and that is what I give you at the very end. I think there is a late reflection of this in one of the dramas by Václav Havel, written 1978, the very same year as our text, The Power of the Powerless. 1978, actually the premiere, as very often with Havel at that time, was in Vienna at the Burgtheater. The play is called Protest. And it's part of the Vaniek trilogy. It's number 3 of the Vaniek trilogy. And those of you who know Havel a bit, you know that Vaniek is an alter ego of himself. He's an intellectual working in a brewery. This was his own destiny. And then in this protest, there is the famous talk between Vaniek and Staniek. Staniek is the other one. And in Staniek, if you want, we don't have to, but we can see Kundera actually personified. And so Staniek, this friend, approaches his old friend Vaniek, and they always disagreed on should we be dissidents or not. And Staniek always said, no, it makes no sense. Why should I risk my life? Why should I risk my career? I don't want to do this. And Vaniek always was the dissident. But then at some point, Staniek has a future son-in-law, a hopeful son-in-law, and this son-in-law becomes imprisoned. And obviously he wants his daughter to have the son-in-law back. And then he goes over to Vaniek and says, Vaniek, you have to write a petition to release him. And Vaniek says, well, I have already written it. It's already there. The only thing that has to be done is you have to sign it as well. And then Staniek comes with this very long and painful explanation. You know, I can't do this at the moment. And in the end, the main line of his argument is actually saying, well, I would do even more harm to it than any good to this, so I can't sign it. And you have to understand that I can't sign it. So you can take this as a late reflex on the Kundera-Havel debate in Havel's dramatic play. And what you see in here, I guess, is independent of the communist regime of Czechoslovakia or whatever, independent of all this, this is an eternal, universal antagonism of how to behave in an oppressive regime, how to behave in a totalitarian regime. These are the questions that always come back. It doesn't matter if you speak about today's China or that time's Czechoslovakia. This is the eternal questions for dissidents. Do we really want to risk it? And I just take this as a final thing. Protest, written 1978, is a wonderful thing. And if one only reads this very short passage, I find this very, very helpful, very instructive to see that. And maybe, Milan, I give the final word to you now. I wanted to just mention this episode, and maybe you can tell us in the end. I put it in a very simple question. It's not that very fair, but also not that mean. So who, in the end, for you, maybe as your personal judgment, who came out as the winner in this debate between Kundera and Havel? You can also have a as well as, and on the other hand, answer, obviously.
Well, I'm afraid I can't give you a clear answer to your question, although the question is very clear. And I think we can understand the whole query also, and we can interpret it differently. And the quarrel or struggle was, according to my reading in 1968, more about the interpretation of the Prague Spring and efforts to reform socialism. And for Kundera didn't share Havel's attitude that socialism should be abandoned and we should simply accept the Western model of capitalism, Western liberal democracy. And for Kundera, politics was a tool, just a tool to create culture. And according to him, the 1968 and the years before were great, since it was the era where in which the best works appeared, best movies, best books were written ever in the whole century of Czechoslovakian history. So for him it was great, and for Havel it was simply a dead end. And since there was no chance to reform socialism, it was just a very short time of relief. But it was still an oppressive regime, and so another reflection in Kundera's books, novels, can be found in a book on Laughter and Forgetting. It was published in German also. Das Buch vom Lassen und Vergessen, where it is a very complex novel, but in the first part, Kundera depicts a dissenter named Mirek. And what Mirek is doing is that he simply wants to be a martyr. And not only this, he stores his personal archive of letters and notes. And in those letters, there are his friends mentioned. He put them into danger, his relatives. But one thing he is attempting to get from his former love from his young age, his Liebesbriefe, his letters, why he did it. She was a communist, but it was not decisive. She was ugly. Yeah, and Mirek wanted to create a certain self-appearance. He knew that he will be then into jail, and he wanted his collective, his personal memory, his personal archive to be read, and he wanted to be interpreted in some way. And to this desired self-image, the love to the ugly girl, simply didn't fit. And so what he was doing, Timberlake was doing, was attempting to do, that he wanted to be a master of his personal memory. And according to Kundera, this is very similar to what communists attempt to do, to be masters of memory, masters of history, to erase people, to rename streets, to delete simply people from archives. So, final point, it is very, according to Kundera, very dangerous to suppose that in the political opposition, that those who are in political opposition, those who are dissenters, they might be brave, but that doesn't mean that they're always moral, since moral intentions lies beneath the surface. They are maybe sometimes even hidden to ourselves. So to simply presuppose that those who are in opposition are moral persons and morally better is a danger.
So I understand, Milan, you didn't want to give us a yes or no answer or black or white answer. I would at least dare to say that, but this is just my personal note, I would at least dare to say that Václav Havel was victorious somehow in the quarrel, but, and then there would be a very, very long but, and I save you from this long but now because we're already over time. The last thing I have to do is, and I take pleasure in doing that, to thank Milan for being with us on this discussion of Václav Havel's Power and the Powerless, and to thank you for being here. And I hope that you got a bit of also of a discussion of powerlessness, and maybe this is really something unique that we did today. I don't know if there's very many other events that actually discuss powerlessness, but this I can't tell, and I'm happy to see you back, all of you, on some of the other events here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ludger. Thank you all.